was kind of probably was a big downer at the banquet, don't you think? You know, all of a sudden, it was kind of a, you know, and Herod then saw the ghost of John from then on out. He thought Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. He kept thinking about what he had done. And so when Jesus hears in chapter 6, if you go over to chapter 6, you find that he gathers his disciples in verse 30. John the Baptist has been beheaded, and in 6:30 the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going and they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many of them, leaving, recognized him and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So Jesus, after John is baptized, says, let's get away for a while. You know, Jesus in the other Gospels has a eulogy for John and says that of all the anybody born of a woman, no one is greater than John the Baptist. You know, that was, you know, John said he must increase when he met Jesus. You know, John had a big thing going in the Jordan Valley. Everybody was coming to him. He was the big deal. He was on CNN, you know, he was on all the nightly news shows. Everybody was talking about him, you know, John the Baptist. Jesus shows up and gets baptized, and John says, that's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Pretty soon people started leaving John the Baptist and started gravitating toward Jesus. And some of John's disciples said, hey, that guy that you said he and his followers are also baptizing people. And John said, I must decrease and he must increase. That's why he was such, you know, he was the last prophet of the Old Testament. Even though he's in the New Testament, he's the last prophet of the Old Testament era, John the Baptist. And Jesus had tremendous respect and love for him. And wouldn't it be wonderful if Jesus said to you at your funeral, there's nobody quite like, you know, Don there. Great guy, you know, my man. You know, I said, one of the best people ever born. Wouldn't that be something? That's what he says of John. John's beheaded. They throw his body over the wall. The disciples get it and bury him. And Jesus says, let's get away. And then something happens in chapter 6 that I want to make sure we address, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus, if you look at a dial of a clock, and if Capernaum, if the lake, I mean, that represented the Sea of Galilee. At the 12 o'clock was Capernaum, and down around 3 o'clock or so is on the shore, as you look at the lake. That's probably where they ended up. There's some debate over where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, but most likely it was in that area. And so they go, and the reason they get in the boat is just to get away from people. You know, just to get away. Do you ever get peopled out? Anybody here ever get peopled out? You just say, I'm just peopled out, you know, I'm going to let that one go to voicemail. I don't want to talk to anybody, you know. And so Jesus said, we need to get away. So they get away, but people see them leave. And so if they don't have boats, they start following along the shore and start running, and they get ahead of where the boat is. They're in no big hurry. They don't have a speedboat here. And so they get there, and when they arrive, Jesus teaches them. And by the way, the feeding of the 5,000 is in all 4 Gospels. Now think about that for a moment. How many Gospels is the raising of Lazarus from the dead in? One. You know, it's interesting. The raising of Lazarus, which was quite monumental, was only recorded in John, but the feeding of the 5,000 is recorded in all 4 Gospels for several reasons. He gets ahead, he gets there on the shore, and the people are gathered. He teaches them. It's a remote place. You get down to verse 37, and Jesus says, you give them something to eat. These people have been here listening to me all day now, and they're hungry, and they're gonna faint on the way back. They're hungry. You ever been someplace working with people who are hungry? I mean, in Haiti, when I've been there, people get up early in the morning and walk because we'd started at 9 in the morning, end at noon before it got hot. And they had to walk home and they'd be hungry. And so while I'm there teaching with my interpreter, there'd be a couple of women outside under a tree with a gigantic pot, those huge old pots, with like a paddle for a canoe, cooking rice and beans out there, because we always brought those things. And paper plates, you had to eat like that because you didn't have silverware. But because people were hungry. They were just hungry, and these people are hungry. And so then we know the story of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus feeds them all. Now, this is the Passover that it probably happens in about April. There's a lot of green grass there still. I've put up here, you can't see it, you can come up here later and look, but these are the rainfall in the area. When is the rainy season? And I've been fascinated with the weather in the New Testament, because during times of the rainy seasons, Jesus taught in synagogues and inside, and in times when it was not the rainy season, he taught outside. And so here he is. Here it's just at the end, there's not much precipitation now. There's a lot of green grass. They're on the side of the mountain, and Jesus is teaching them. And it's probably a Passover, and it's the one Passover that Jesus, we think, did not attend. He was too hot a commodity, too much opposition. If he went to Jerusalem, it wasn't his time yet. And so that's one reason why there were so many people. It said 5,000 men plus their families. We call it the feeding of the 5,000. Could have been the feeding of the 15,000, 20,000, who knows? And so he feeds them. What do you think was the message that Jesus was communicating by feeding them that way? Let me ask it this way. What would you think of Jesus after that? You're in the crowd.
Well, he was compassionate, cared the fact that they were hungry.
He's compassionate. Does he have power?
He also identified him as the Son of God, as someone very powerful, if not the Son of God.
Yeah.
Thinking in those terms.
If he wasn't the Son of God, what would the Son of God do if it's not something like this? 5,000, you imagine that. I don't know how long that took. I don't know how the miracle exactly worked. But, imagine that. People who live, we go to the grocery store, we get food from Mexico, Argentina, Chile, we get all over the world. We have food. If you're in an agrarian culture that depends upon rainfall and the planting of crops and all that, a bad drought, you'll go hungry. And so for these people to see someone who can feed them with just some sardines and little wafers, it's amazing. And that's why it's recorded in all 4 Gospels. It doesn't say this here, but in John we know that after he did this, if you look in verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him. What happens that you don't have recorded here, but John, when he records it, said the people wanted to make him king right then. Forget this Herod. Forget Pontius Pilate. Forget the Romans. This is our man right here. Make him king. Logistics are no problem. You know, he can feed an army with just a lunch. He can, anybody gets in a battle, he can heal them. He can probably rain down fire from heaven. And he said they wanted to make him king. And I think the reason he sent his apostles ahead in a boat and he went away is because they were getting caught up in it too. You know, they were getting caught up in all this, you know, Jesus, you know, he's our king. You know, I mean, this is all going. So he gets in a boat and says, guys, you guys go ahead, get out of here. Let me dismiss the crowds, you know. I'm not going to be your king here today. You know, everybody go home, go on. He goes up in the hills to pray. He comes back and meets them walking on the water. And then we get to chapter 7. All right. Chapter 7 is very interesting because remember that Romans, the book of Mark is written to the Romans. It's probably written in Rome to a Roman audience. And throughout the book of Mark, he explains words and customs that the Jews did, that the Romans would not be familiar with. And at the same time, you find that Matthew doesn't explain those things because he's writing to Jews and they know. So you get to chapter 7, and the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean, that is, ceremonially unwashed hands. The Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? It's interesting that again, we have about 4% of the public ministry of Jesus. In other words, we have about 52 to 55 days, individual days. And he had a ministry of 1,260. So you often wonder, okay, how was this material selected to be in here? Why did the Spirit, who's guiding the writers of these books, include this? And in here we have a rather lengthy discussion of a Jewish custom that he's talking about to a Roman audience. So think about that for a moment, because Jesus replies, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. Now, that's the point. That's what Jesus is going after now, is superficial, works-type religion, ceremonial, ritual-type religion that doesn't reach the heart. And he's going to spend some time on that with them and back and forth as they confront him about this. But he says, these people honor me with their lips, from Isaiah, but their hearts are far from me. Now, does that ever happen to you? Do you just go sometimes through the routine and the ritual?
If you're not careful.
Huh?
If you're not mindful.
Yeah. If you're not careful, if you're not mindful. It can happen at the Lord's Supper, can it? Be at the Lord's Supper and, oh yeah, you can take it and all that, but your mind is a million miles away. You're thinking about everything else but that. That's why Mark included this teaching of Jesus in here, because in fact, Jesus says, you hypocrites, which is interesting. Because Jesus is the only one in the scripture that uses the word hypocrite. And you have to think about that for a minute. Why would, it was a Greek term. It was used for the actors in a Greek play. You've seen those masks sometimes you'll see at a theater or something. In the Greek dramas, they would wear these masks. In fact, the word originally, hypocrite, meant a masker, somebody that wore a mask. Where would Jesus, why would he use that term? And he uses it frequently. In the 23rd chapter of Matthew, 7 times he calls the Pharisees hypocrites.
Because he can see the heart. He knows whether or not they mean what they're doing.
He sees their heart. But again, going back to the use of the term, in Nazareth, where he grew up, and he was a carpenter. His father was a carpenter. He learned the trade of being a carpenter. It wasn't a large village. But if you went down the hill and up the hill on the other side, there was a town about 45-minute walk away, hour away, called Sepphoris. And it was a Roman city that was built as a kind of administrative center. It was about 20,000 people. They had the theater, the large amphitheaters there. They had, it was, quite a place. There wasn't that, you think about it, there probably wasn't that much building at times going on in Nazareth. How could you support yourself? Well, you grabbed your lunch bucket and tools and you walked over to Sepphoris. They're building like crazy over there. They had those Swedish cranes on the skyline everywhere you could see, so to speak. Now they were building and building and building. And there they had where would Jesus have encountered that term, and where would he have seen it? Well, I believe that he probably, when he went to that town, at some point sat in that amphitheater and watched a Greek play going on, and the masker, the hypocrite, the actor came out. He was fascinated by that term, and he used it. And he said, people who are play acting their religion, they're hypocrites. Hypocrites. And so I think that, I doubt if Peter or John or anybody else ever went to Sepphoris and saw a play. But it was close enough that, and if Jesus was a contractor, which is what tekton means, a carpenter, you think of him building little children's toys, but he was really a carpenter. You look, what did he build with over there? Stone. He was like a stonemason, a contractor, and Jesus and probably his brothers were in the trade too. And so where would they go to get enough work to support the family? Well, they probably went down the hill and up the other side where there was a lot of construction and 20,000 people moving in. And so he saw that. He saw the play. He saw the hypocrite. And he thought, that's a fitting term for what I see going on in our religion. Now, by the way, there's only one passage in the book of Leviticus that has anything to do with washing hands. And that has to do with if you have a disease and they're afraid to, you have some kind of a discharge and that you're going to communicate that disease. In the book of Leviticus, there were some instructions on hand washing. But 500 years earlier than the birth of Jesus, while they were in captivity, they started developing an oral tradition, because when you are separated from the temple in Jerusalem and you can't have sacrifices anymore, and your country's been defeated, the temple's been destroyed, and your whole system of sacrifice, you cannot do, and you're in a foreign country, how are you going to be a Jew? Well, 3 things developed. One was a synagogue. They don't have synagogues in the Old Testament. Synagogue developed during the captivity. They started meeting and teaching that way. Sabbath keeping became a very important thing while in captivity, because you had to kind of distinguish yourself from the people around you. And circumcision, the rite of circumcision. So those 3 things became big deals during the captivity, bigger even than they were in the Old Testament. It became even bigger. It kind of reminds me of, I spent several years working on the Nisqually Indian Reservation in western Washington. And it used to amuse me that the Indians that lived off the reservation acted more Indian than the ones that lived on the reservation. And the ones on the reservation used to make fun of the ones that lived off the reservation for, hanging dream catchers off their mirrors, and having bumper stickers and all this. They tried to act more Indian than the ones that lived there. Well, when the Jews were separated and not on the reservation anymore, they started doing things to really act like they were Jewish. And so Jesus, part of the oral tradition, this wasn't written down, by the way. The Mishnah or the commentary on the Old Testament of the Jews was not written until 300 years after Jesus completed his ministry. So all of this was an oral tradition that they kept. And they had this tradition about washing hands. It was very elaborate. You had to put your fingers up, and then you had to put them down. You had to put your fist in one. I mean, they had this whole thing. And Jesus' disciples didn't do it. That's not very Jewish. You're supposed to be a Jew teaching, you're a rabbi, and your disciples don't even act like Jews. That's what we're supposed to do. And Jesus said, we don't pay any attention to that stuff. Those are just the traditions of men. That has nothing to do with what God said. Now, do we do things as a group that are just because it's our traditions? I see heads nodding. And have nothing to do with what in the Bible. So you can see why Mark included this in his gospel, because it applies to us too, don't we? We have our own traditions. Somebody said to me, and not too long ago, he said, why can't we just raise our hands and praise God? And she answered her own question. She goes, we don't do that. That's our tradition, right? There's no verse that says you have to raise or not raise. Oh, and although there is a verse that says to raise holy hands in prayer in 1 Timothy chapter 2, men are supposed to pray that way. We don't do that. But in other words, we have our own traditions, don't we? Yeah, I mean, I'm still a little out of sorts that we've changed our communion service, because I grew up seeing it passed to me. You know what I'm saying? I didn't have to have a little trash bag when I took communion, I mean, it just kind of, and then even before that, I'm old enough, I remembered when part of the communion service was they broke the bread and poured. Because part of the image just isn't the emblems, but the body that was broken, the blood that was poured. I can remember in those days, the olden days, when that was done. So, yeah, we have our traditions, don't we? And I have to get past this and the little baggie to remember what it's really all about. You know what I'm saying? That's my issue I got to deal with, see? So that I'm just not going through the motions and thinking, I sure don't like this. We're talking about the body and blood of our Lord. Don, you?
One time, many years ago, Laura and I visited a Sunday morning in a little Church of Christ outside of Lincoln. And it came to communion. Well, these folks were one couple. And they all took a sip out of the same cup. And by the time it got to me, 20 people had already sipped out of that cup, because it was a little bit uncomfortable.
Well, they used to say at one cuppers, you make sure you sit in the front row. You sit up front, and if the guy's chewing tobacco, you want to make sure you're way sitting in front of that guy, sipping out of the cup, so. But what the point is that we have a lot of traditions that don't have any basis. We try, if you'd asked the Pharisees, do you have a base? Oh, yes, we do. And they would have had this elaborate system and all that. So, sometimes how much do you think that what we do in the church is just tradition? Put a number on it. 10%, 20%, 30%? How much of the way we operate and do church, how much of it is just tradition? How much of
Turn
it?
it around sometime and you'll find out.
Oh, yeah.
Change it.
Yeah, when you change it, you find out, oh, you've stepped on the traditions here, you know. I guess I stepped on a tradition here a while back. I did not realize it at the time, but every church has their own things, the way they do things, see. And you're probably wonder what he's talking about. I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to let you think about it. I'll just let you wonder about that one. But
communion, we did the bags because of people's health. People were dying,
Sure.
from the germs, and that.
Sure. I mean, I understand why we did it, and because of COVID and all that. But COVID's over, and you know what I'm saying? It's over, and but I can still use the baggie and that. But in my heart, I'm imagining it being passed, and you know what I'm saying? And but the point is that Jesus is interested in getting to your heart, not the ritual. No matter how we choose to do communion, it's about our heart, right? And I asked a question up here, can you do the right things and not be right with God? Were the Pharisees trying to do the right things? Sometimes. Were they right with God? No. Can you do the right things? You can be baptized, you can show up church every week and take communion, you can give some money, you can do all these things. Can you do all that and still not be right with God? Yeah. If it becomes ritual, habit, tradition. Traditions aren't bad as long as it reaches your heart. But sometimes we go on cruise control. You know what I'm saying? We get on cruise control. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Is that when we go through the motion, we're doing all the things, we're doing the motion. But our heart and head isn't there. It's someplace else. We sing songs at times that are prayers to God, and we sing it as if, oh gosh, how many more verses are we going to sing of this thing? We're just not there. We're not there. It doesn't mean we don't need to do the best we can and meet the needs of most people. But Jesus is saying here, and he gives an example in verse 9. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help and you would otherwise receive from me is Corban, that is a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. They had this custom was, you're supposed to take care of your father and mother. So let's say you've got your father and mother in need, and you just bought an RV, and you got a timeshare, and you've got all this stuff going on, and you can't afford, to help your parents out. So you just say, any money I have, it's dedicated to God. The term was Corban. It's Corban. I'd really like to help you, Dad, but I've already dedicated that money to God. And in the meantime, God's letting me use it. Jesus said, what hypocrites. You worry about washing hands, all these little customs, but when the Ten Commandments says honor your father and mother, you are able to figure out ways to get around it. He said, you nullify what God said by your traditions and all that. So ask yourself at times, for yourself, what traditions have become sacred to you? I had to laugh because my mother, it's church in Olympia, Church of Christ, where I was for a number of years. We removed the communion table. I forget why at the time. I forget why we did it. It didn't come back to me. But my mother, every week, because she attended, would say, where is the communion table? It says, do this in remembrance of me. I mean, to her, if it didn't have the communion table, do this in remembrance of me, it couldn't be communion. One Sunday, I just got a slide and put it up there. And said, there, Mom, it's right there. She goes, it's not the same. It's not the same, you know. And so, ask yourself, where's your heart? Are you locked into, we design sometimes systems to keep us from being compassionate, from caring. That's what ritual does. Keeps us from caring. We just go through the motions. We say, we're okay with God. God, you owe me heaven because I've been baptized. I'm showing up at the Lord's Supper. I'm doing this, this, and this. You owe me. What does God owe you? Not a thing. You think that you deserved heaven because you went through and got dunked in water? Somehow that act guaranteed eternal, that you earned eternal life by that? It's by the grace of God that you put yourself in union with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what it's about. It's about Him. We need the John the Baptist attitude. I must decrease that He might increase in my life. Now, as you're go over to chapter 8, He feeds 4,000 in chapter 8, and some people are a little confused by that. Seriously? Did they just confuse? And it's really only one time and somebody? No. The feeding of the 4,000, if you look on that map overhead, in that black area south of the Sea of Galilee is in the area there of, let me see if I can see it myself from here. The Decapolis, the purple there, you see that purple area? That box? The Decapolis, the 10 cities, the 10 Greek cities called the Decapolis. A lot of, when Alexander the Great conquered the world, one way he paid his soldiers was giving them land, and they settled in places. The Decapolis was one of those places where there were 10 Greek cities, a league of 10 cities. And Jesus is on that side of the lake, and they go into that area again to get away from the Jewish people so He can teach His disciples. Well, the Gentiles also have heard about Him, and so they gather. And so when it comes time for them at the end of the day, and they're hungry, and Jesus said, we need to feed these people, you'd ask this question, have I seen this before? Wouldn't you ask that question? You say, why are they so confused? Jesus fed 5,000. So why are they acting so surprised and say, where can we get enough food? Hey, we've had this same conversation before. But if you don't understand the geography and where He was, it wouldn't make sense. But when you see, He was in a non-Jewish area. The Jews were very exclusive. If these people are hungry, you are the Messiah of the Jews. You are not the Messiah of the Gentiles. And that's why their hesitancy and why they didn't say, oh yeah, sure, Jesus, you did this before. We'll find a lunch. We'll all get this done. You feed them. We'll be on our way. No, they were going, hey, these aren't Jews. And so that's why they were confused. And so the feeding of the 4,000 took place in an area where it wasn't a Jewish population, and it totally confused them because Jesus came for the Jews. In fact, when they were up in Tyre and Sidon and places like that, a woman that came to Him had a daughter possessed by demons, and remember as you read that, and he said, well, I've come for the Jewish people, and she said, well, even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table. And Jesus said, well done. Good answer. She's healed. So then one other thing, as we got just 2 minutes here, we get to the point, we'll pick up next week, where in verse 27 of chapter 8, Jesus is up in Caesarea Philippi, which is up on the slopes of Mount Hermon, the headwaters of the Jordan River. And he is there, and he says, "Who do people say I am?" He's just with his apostles. They replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, still others, one of the prophets. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" You've been traveling with me. Here, they've been with him at least a year, some of them up to 2 years. Some of the first disciples that were picked up at the very beginning of his ministry. So now these guys have been with him. He said, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You're the Christ. You're the anointed." Christ, as he means anointed. You're the anointed one. You're selected by God. You're the Messiah. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Why? Seems like now that they knew it, let's get on Twitter and X and let's spread the word. Let's get he said, "Don't tell anybody." And then, right after that, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And then Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and rebuked Peter. "Out of my sight, Satan. You have not the mind of the things of God, but the things of men." Remember, first he has to teach them who he is. Now he has to teach them what that means. And it just absolutely blew their mind that the Messiah would be killed. And he said that he must be rejected by the elders. He must be killed. 3 days rise again was his foreign language, and they have no clue what that meant. They didn't know what it meant to be killed. And Jesus says to Peter, right after he makes his profession of faith, "You are the Christ," he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're thinking about the way men think, not how God thinks." All right, we'll stop there, and we'll pick up next week. Next week we'll be in chapters 9 and 10.